The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles of water between the Musandam Peninsula of Oman and the Iranian coastline at Bandar Abbas. 21 miles through which 33% of all globally traded petroleum products move every single day. 21 miles that, for 50 years, the United States Navy has treated as the non-negotiable red line of global economic stability, the one geographic choke point on Earth where American military power would always be present, always dominant, and always sufficient to guarantee that the oil kept moving. That guarantee expired 47 minutes ago. At 4:19 in the morning, Strait of Hormuz local time, the USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group, operating under full combat conditions since its emergency repositioning 6 days ago, came under simultaneous attack from 4 separate vector directions. Not a probe, not a warning shot, not the harassing fire that the Fifth Fleet has been managing in rotating engagement cycles since the crisis began. A coordinated, pre-planned, multi-domain offensive strike package that has been building in the intelligence feeds for 72 hours and that every analyst tracking the situation knew was approaching and none could stop in time. The details are still being confirmed. The battle damage assessment is not complete. The casualty figures have not been officially released, but what is confirmed, what satellite imagery, signals intelligence, maritime tracking data, and direct reporting from vessels in the immediate vicinity have established beyond any analytical dispute, is this. 2 American warships have been struck. One is on fire. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Not threatened, not at risk. Not operating under elevated tension, closed. The 21 miles of water that moves the global economy is, at this moment, a war zone. And the world that existed before 4:19 this morning does not exist anymore. What happened in the Strait in the last 47 minutes is not a battle. It is the opening movement of a strategic transformation whose consequences will touch every economy, every military alliance, every diplomatic relationship, and every government on Earth. Not eventually. Not in the coming months. Now, today, in the next 72 hours, decisions will be made in Washington, Tehran, Beijing, Riyadh, Tokyo, and Brussels that will define the architecture of global order for the next generation. And those decisions are being made right now by people who have not slept, who are working from incomplete information, and who understand that the cost of being wrong is not political. It is civilizational. Stay with this completely. Because the mechanism that produced what happened 47 minutes ago in the Strait of Hormuz has been running for 8 months, and understanding that mechanism is the only way to understand what comes next. And what comes next is the part that no one is talking about yet. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz is now a war zone, it is necessary to understand what the strait actually is, not as a geographic feature, but as a strategic system. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a body of water. It is the circulatory valve of the global industrial economy. Every barrel of oil that leaves Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Iraq, and Qatar passes through it. 17 million barrels of crude per day from the Gulf Cooperation Council states alone. 4 million additional barrels from Iraqi export terminals. Iranian crude moving through shadow networks. Liquefied natural gas from Qatar's North Field, the single largest natural gas reservoir on Earth, supplying the heating, electricity generation, and industrial feedstock for economies from Japan to Germany. All of it moves through 21 miles. The United States understood from the moment of Iran's 1979 revolution that the strait represented the most consequential geographic vulnerability in the global system. The Carter Doctrine, announced in January 1980, declared explicitly that any attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States and would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. Any means necessary. The most expansive commitment in the history of American foreign policy outside of the NATO Mutual Defense Article. A commitment that created the Fifth Fleet, the pre-positioned military infrastructure across Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE, and the carrier strike group rotation that has maintained continuous American naval presence in the region for 45 years. The IRGC Navy understood all of this. It has studied the Carter Doctrine, the subsequent Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and current administration iterations of Persian Gulf policy and the operational deployments that give those policies meaning for 4 decades. It has run its own simulations, its own red team exercises, its own assessment of the conditions under which American naval dominance in the strait could be successfully challenged. And it reached a conclusion that it has been building toward for 8 years. The conclusion was not that the United States Navy could be defeated in open conventional combat. It could not. The Fifth Fleet's combat power, the air wings, the surface combatants, the submarine presence, the electronic warfare architecture, the logistics train, there is no Iranian military force that can match it in a sustained conventional engagement. The IRGC Navy understood this completely. It built its strategy not on matching American naval power, but on making American naval power irrelevant. On creating a combat environment in the strait so complex, so multi-domain, so saturated with simultaneous threats across every engagement spectrum simultaneously, that American naval dominance at the platform level could not translate into operational control of the waterway. The doctrine has a name inside the IRGC operational planning structure. It translates approximately as the mosaic defense, not a single line of defense, not a concentrated military force, a mosaic. Thousands of individually small, individually non-decisive elements distributed across the entire geographic and electromagnetic space of the confrontation that combine into a defensive and offensive system whose center of gravity cannot be targeted because it does not have a center. A system that cannot be decapitated because it has no head. A system that cannot be suppressed because suppressing any element simply redistributes the threat load to the surviving elements. Here is what Iran deployed 47 minutes ago, and why the mosaic shattered every model. The first layer of the attack that struck the USS Baton Ready Group at 4:19 this morning was the layer that existing American defense systems were most prepared to handle. 43 anti-ship cruise missiles, Chinese-designed C-802 variants upgraded with Iranian terminal guidance packages that reduced the radar cross-section by 38% from the baseline configuration that American phalanx close-in weapon systems were calibrated to engage. The missiles came from 3 directions simultaneously, from shore-based launchers on the Iranian coastline near Bandar Abbas, from 2 fast attack craft that had been operating in civilian vessel emission profiles for 11 days, and from a submarine, one of the 3 Kilo-class submarines that Iran purchased from Russia in the 1990s and has spent 3 decades quietly upgrading, that achieved firing position at a depth of 40 meters without triggering the acoustic sensors of the Baton Group's ASW screen. 31 of the 43 missiles were intercepted. 12 were not. That intercept rate, 72%, would be classified as a success by the operational parameters of every American anti-ship missile defense exercise conducted in the last 15 years. 72% intercept against a simultaneous multi-vector anti-ship missile salvo is, by every historical metric, an exceptional defensive performance. 12 missiles got through. 2 American warships were struck. 1 is on fire. The mathematics of saturation attacks are not complicated. They are simply resistant to the institutional optimism that shapes military planning in every nation. If a defense system intercepts at 72% and the attacker launches enough missiles, the 12% that get through are not a failure rate. They are a targeting solution, but the cruise missile layer was not the weapon that closed the strait. It was the signature, the distraction. The element that activated every American defensive system, consumed the combat management processing capacity of every ship in the group, pulled every radar into active emission mode, and painted the precise electronic signature of every American platform in the engagement area onto the electromagnetic environment in a way that the second layer of the attack was specifically designed to exploit. The second layer was unmanned. 317 Shahed derivatives, not the jet-propelled variants that the IDF encountered in the earlier phase of this crisis, but a new configuration that the American intelligence community had been tracking as a developmental program and had assessed as being 18 to 24 months from operational deployment. The assessment was wrong by 22 months. The new configuration, which Iranian state media began referring to in the hours after the attack by a designation that translates roughly as the swarming variant, carries a smaller individual warhead than its predecessors, but operates within a coordinated electronic mesh that allows the swarm to collectively identify, prioritize, and engage targets in a sequence optimized not for individual lethality, but for defensive system exhaustion. The swarm does not try to hit one ship with one drone. It tries to make every ship fire every interceptor it carries at every drone in sequence until there are no interceptors left, and the drones that remain can approach unmolested. The phalanx systems aboard the Baton Group fired 9,047 rounds in the 12 minutes of the swarm engagement. 9,000 rounds? The ready ammunition load for a phalanx system in standard configuration is approximately 1,500 rounds per system. The mathematics of what that means for the defensive posture of the ships that are still floating in the Strait of Hormuz right now are not ambiguous. The third layer closed the strait and has not been fully defeated. 41 naval mines, not the legacy contact mines whose signatures the American mine-sweeping capability was designed to detect and neutralize, but influence mines using a combination of magnetic, acoustic, and pressure fusing that responds not to the presence of a vessel, but to the specific signature profile of a vessel whose characteristics match pre-programmed target parameters. They are sleeping in the shipping lanes of the strait right now. American minesweeping assets are en route. The estimated clearance time, based on the known density of the minefield as assessed from aerial surveillance, is 11 to 17 days. 11 to 17 days during which the Strait of Hormuz is closed, during which no tanker captain with access to accurate information will move a vessel through the world's most consequential maritime choke point, during which the oil that was supposed to arrive next week in Tokyo and Seoul and Mumbai and Shanghai and every other major industrial economy that depends on Gulf petroleum will not arrive. The world's oil markets opened this morning to this news. The opening price movement is the largest single-session move in the history of petroleum futures trading, larger than the 1973 Arab oil embargo, larger than the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, larger than any previous supply shock that the modern global economy has absorbed, because previous supply shocks disrupted the flow. This one has physically sealed the valve. And now look at what this means not just for the energy market, but for the military and political architecture that every nation on Earth is going to be reconstructing in real time over the next 72 hours. In Washington, the National Security Council convened its emergency session at 11:23 p.m. Eastern Time, before dawn in the strait but fully dark on the American East Coast, when the first confirmed reports reached the Situation Room. The session is ongoing. The decisions being worked through in that room right now have a specific sequential logic that the crisis has forced on the decision makers regardless of their preferences. The first decision is force protection. The ships in the strait that have been struck need support. The ships that were not struck need resupply of the defensive munitions they expended. The submarines that form the undersea component of the Fifth Fleet's response capability need updated targeting information. All of this is being coordinated. All of this is happening. The second decision is escalation management. Every military response the United States executes in the next 72 hours will either expand the conflict to domains and actors who are not yet directly engaged, or will narrow it in ways that create the conditions for a negotiated stabilization. The targeting options on the CENTCOM menu right now range from strikes on specific IRGC Navy installations that directly participated in the attack, which is the minimum response option, to a comprehensive air campaign against Iran's entire military infrastructure, which is the maximum option. Every point between those two extremes is a different war with different consequences. The decision of where on that spectrum to respond is not being made on military grounds alone. It is being made in the context of three simultaneous constraints that the people in that Situation Room cannot ignore regardless of their preferred military outcome. The first constraint is China. Beijing has 18 naval vessels operating in the broader Arabian Sea region as part of its anti-piracy rotation, a presence that has been continuous since 2008 and has provided China with persistent maritime intelligence collection in the region that no other Chinese platform could achieve. Those 18 vessels are not combatants in any formal sense, but their presence in the operational environment of whatever the United States does next is a condition that every targeting decision must account for. An American strike that produces Chinese casualties, however accidental, however geometrically unavoidable, produces a political and strategic crisis that dwarfs the current one. The second constraint is the global economy. The oil price movement that opened this morning is not a trading event. It is a structural economic signal that tells every finance ministry, every central bank, and every corporate treasury on Earth that the energy cost assumptions on which their current operational plans are built are wrong. Recalibrating those assumptions takes time. The economy does not give that time. The price signal begins transmitting into the real economy within days, in fuel costs, in shipping rates, in manufacturing input costs, in food prices for the commodities whose production and distribution chains depend on petroleum-based energy at every stage. Every day the strait remains closed adds compounding economic damage to an interconnected global system that was not operating from a position of strength before this morning. The third constraint is the alliance. Japan has already contacted Washington requesting emergency consultations on the energy situation. The call was not diplomatic in tone. It was direct. South Korea's National Security Council has convened. India's Ministry of External Affairs issued a statement at 6 a.m. Mumbai time that used the specific diplomatic language that means we need to talk before you do anything else. The European Union's Energy Emergency Protocol has been activated for the first time in its history. These are not nations offering support. These are nations communicating that the decisions made in Washington in the next 72 hours will determine whether the alliance architecture that American foreign policy has depended on for 70 years continues to function or begins the fracture process that America's adversaries have been engineering for a decade. The constraint these three conditions create is not a paralysis. America will respond. The political, military, and institutional logic of the situation makes non-response impossible. But the response must be calibrated in a way that addresses the military reality of what happened in the strait, manages the escalation risk with China, prevents the economic damage from becoming structural, and preserves the alliance relationships that any sustained response requires. That calibration is the hardest problem in the history of American strategic decision-making, and the clock for solving it is measured in hours. Here's the revelation that no published report has reached yet, the development that transforms this from a military crisis into something categorically unprecedented and that will define everything that follows. Iran did not act alone in the strait this morning. The mosaic that struck the Bataan Ready group was not assembled from Iranian components alone. The upgraded terminal guidance packages on the C-802 derivatives contain navigation system components that Iranian domestic production cannot manufacture at the required precision specification. The new Shahed swarming variant's electronic mesh coordination system operates on a frequency hopping protocol whose architecture was not visible in any Iranian developmental program tracked by American signals intelligence. The influence mine design incorporates pressure fusing technology, whose engineering pedigree, assessed through the physical characteristics of the mines that have been recovered intact, traces to a production facility that is not Iranian. The components came from 3 separate supply chains. All 3 were visible in retrospect. None were identified prospectively because they moved through commercial channels, through intermediary trading companies, through the global electronic supply chain that serves military and civilian customers simultaneously and whose volume is too enormous for any monitoring system to comprehensively surveil. They moved in shipping containers labeled as industrial electronics components. They moved on vessels whose manifests listed legitimate commercial cargo. They arrived at Iranian ports that handle thousands of containers per week and whose inspection rate, even under the heightened monitoring of the last 14 months, does not exceed 4% of incoming cargo. The three supply chains trace back to their origins through a forensic reconstruction that American intelligence agencies began 8 months ago and completed 6 weeks before the attack. The reconstruction identified the origins. It identified the routing. It identified the transfer points. The information was provided to the relevant decision-making levels. The response to that information was a classified assessment designating the supply chain activity as significant but not immediately actionable given the evidentiary thresholds required for the diplomatic and military responses the information implied. That assessment was completed 6 weeks before this morning. The decision not to act on it in a way that would have disrupted the supply chains, interdicted the components, and potentially prevented the assembly of the weapon system that struck 2 American warships was a decision made by real people on the basis of real institutional constraints and real procedural requirements. It was not an irrational decision. It was a decision made by a system that was not designed to move at the speed that this adversary was moving. The origins of those 3 supply chains, the names of the nations, the specific institutions, the decision-making levels at which the transfers were authorized, are the information that the diplomatic crisis of the next 72 hours will revolve around. Because those names change the conflict. They change who is a party to it, what the legal and political obligations of third parties are, and what the United States can do in response without triggering the precise escalation cascade that every crisis management framework is designed to prevent. The names have been communicated privately to the governments of the nations involved. Those governments have been given a specific window to respond with a specific set of actions. The window is 48 hours. The actions required are not ambiguous, and the consequences of noncompliance within the 48-hour window have been communicated in language that does not employ diplomatic euphemism. 48 hours. The clock began at 4:19 this morning. It is already running. The most dangerous element of the next phase of this crisis is not the military situation in the Strait, as catastrophic as that situation is. It is the political situation inside the 3 nations most consequentially affected by the Strait's closure, nations whose internal political dynamics are now being compressed by energy and economic pressure in ways that will produce decisions that no external actor can control or predict. In Japan, the government of Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi was already managing a domestic energy crisis produced by the combination of nuclear capacity restrictions, the global LNG market tightening of the last 18 months, and a yen at levels that make imported energy structurally expensive regardless of the commodity price. The closure of the Strait adds a supply availability crisis to the existing price crisis. Japan's strategic petroleum reserve, maintained at legally mandated levels of approximately 180 days of normal consumption, provides a buffer. But a buffer is a countdown clock. Every day the Strait remains closed is a day subtracted from 180. When the buffer depletes to 90 days, Japanese domestic political pressure will produce responses that Washington's alliance managers will find difficult to accommodate and impossible to prevent. In South Korea, the situation is structurally similar and politically more volatile. South Korea's energy dependence on Gulf petroleum is 81% for crude oil and 53% for liquefied natural gas. Its petrochemical industry, the foundation of the export manufacturing economy that funds the social contract that Korean politics depends on, cannot operate at current capacity with alternative supply sources available at the current price and the current logistical capability to deliver them. The political consequences of energy rationing in South Korea are not theoretical. They are historical. The 1979 oil crisis contributed directly to the political instability that produced the assassination of President Park Chung-hee. The current South Korean government, operating in a domestic political environment already stressed by the constitutional crisis of the last 18 months, does not have the political capital to absorb the social consequences of a prolonged Strait closure without making decisions about its own strategic orientation that Washington will not welcome. In India, the calculation is most complex and most consequential for the long-term architecture of the American-led order. India under Prime Minister Modi has been methodically constructing a strategic positioning that maintains American partnership without accepting the constraints that American partnership has historically implied. The Strait closure creates a pressure point at which India's energy security interests and its strategic partnership with the United States may not be alignable within the same policy framework. India has alternative oil relationships with Russia, with which it has been trading at significant discounts to the global price since the Ukraine-related sanctions disrupted Russian export markets. Deepening those relationships during a Strait closure crisis, which economic logic suggests and Indian domestic politics may demand, produces a strategic consequence that the United States has spent 3 years of diplomatic investment trying to prevent. These three dynamics, Tokyo, Seoul, and New Delhi, simultaneously under energy pressure and making strategic recalibrations, represent the second front of the Hormuz War. The first front is in the water. The second front is in the alliance architecture. And the second front will determine whether the first front produces American strategic success or American strategic overextension in a way that adversaries will exploit for decades. The ships are burning in the strait. The mines are sleeping in the shipping lanes. The minesweepers are 16 hours away at current transit speeds. The oil market is rewriting the global economic baseline in real time. The NSE is deliberating. The 48-hour window is running. Tokyo, Seoul, and New Delhi are recalibrating. The three supply chain origin nations are deciding whether the American communication they received constitutes a threat they must respond to or a bluff they can absorb. None of these variables has reached its resolution point. Every one of them is in motion simultaneously. Every one of them is connected to every other one in ways that mean a resolution of any single variable changes the conditions for resolving all the others. The IRGC Navy commanders who designed the Mosaic attack that executed at 4:19 this morning have achieved their primary operational objective. The strait is closed. American ships are damaged. The defensive munitions of the Bataan Group are depleted. These are facts. They are not reversible facts in the short term. What they have not achieved is their strategic objective. The strategic objective is not a closed strait. A closed strait is a tactic deployed in service of a strategic objective that is considerably more complex than preventing oil tankers from moving through 21 miles of water. The strategic objective is the restructuring of the regional security architecture on terms that the Islamic Republic can accept. The replacement of the American security guarantee in the Gulf, which has been the foundational organizing principle of regional politics since 1980, with something different. Something in which Iran is not a sanctioned, isolated, militarily targeted pariah, but a legitimate and recognized regional power whose security concerns are incorporated into whatever framework governs the Gulf. That objective has not been achieved. It may never be achieved. The gap between what Iran needs to achieve it and what any American administration can offer without destroying its domestic political foundation is the gap that every negotiation attempt of the last 45 years has failed to bridge. But this morning, for the first time, Iran has created the conditions under which the United States must decide whether to pay the cost of bridging that gap or the cost of not bridging it. Both costs are enormous. Both costs are real. And the decision between them will be made by people operating on incomplete information under time pressure in the context of an alliance that is bending and an economy that is bleeding and a military situation that is not static. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. It has been closed before, briefly, in the 1980s tanker war. It has never been closed like this, with American warships burning inside it, with mines in the shipping lanes, with the minesweepers 16 hours out, with the oil price at levels that the global economy has never sustained without structural consequences, with the alliance architecture under simultaneous pressure across three of its most critical nodes, with the 48-hour clock running toward a confrontation with actors whose names have not yet entered the public reporting, it will not remain closed forever. No choke point in the history of maritime conflict has remained closed forever. But how it opens, who opens it, under what political and military conditions, and at what cost to every actor involved, will determine the architecture of the world that exists after it opens. That architecture is being negotiated right now in the NSC, in the back channels, in the conversations between allied capitals, in the deliberations of the three nations who received American communications this morning and have 48 hours to respond, in Tehran, where the commanders who designed the Mosaic are assessing its execution and preparing the next phase of a plan that did not end with the first attack. The strait is closed, the clock is running, and the world that opens it will not be the world that closed it. Watch carefully, because the next 48 hours will not wait.